Hey, this is Chaplain Rich Robinson with the Coastal Crisis Chaplaincy. Thank you so much for coming together to hear about how do we respond to a crisis? How do we plan for a crisis? Many thanks to SCISA and Dr. Jordan for prompting this conversation and coming up with this concept for our schools. Coastal Crisis Chaplaincy serves in many different ways, but one of the ways that we serve is in the Tri-County area, serving Charleston County School District, Berkeley County, and then also Dorchester District 2. And we serve on the crisis response team. So if there's a crisis that happens in the school or in the community but impacts the school, our chaplains will respond out with the school psychologist, someone usually from the district, and a school nurse and guidance staff. And then we'll meet with the students and also the staff members to provide any kind of psychological, emotional, or spiritual support if needed. But one of the things that we always see that comes up is that when people, well, let's just start with this. If you're in education, it's because you love kids and you probably love your staff members if you're a head of school. So when you have a crisis situation happen, a lot of times you're grieving alongside everyone else. And you can't always think logically when you're grieving. So one of the things we know working with folks in crisis all the time is that when the emotions go up, the logic goes down. The ability to think logically, uh, it's diminished. Think of those horror movies where someone can't seem to find the key. They're trying to do a very simple task, but it's very hard to do because our logic starts to go down when the emotion goes up. So if you're a head of school or your guidance staff or you're in leadership and you're trying to help your school through traumatic situation, a lot of times that logical way of thinking starts to diminish. And most people will say, I don't know what to do. We've sat as chaplains across from folks so many times and they just say, chaplain, I know how to do everything else, but this grieving thing and this loss and leading the students and the teachers, I don't know where to start. I don't know what to do. I can do everything else. So what I wanted to do today is give you a sense of what you can do. What I'll do to start is I'll just give you an overview of the chaplaincy and of what we do so you sort of understand the frame of reference that we have to do this kind of work. And then that'll sort of guide the conversation as well. So I'm sharing my screen now. We have several teams here. We have our training team, which prepares us to do everything else. But we have a big team of chaplains that respond out to crisis situations in the community, whether it be a homicide or a suicide or any kind of traumatic incident in the community. And we serve basically as police public safety chaplains. We also do first responder support and follow up afterwards, debriefs, things like that. We also follow up with survivors. We have a continuum of traumatic grief care that we start from the scene through our survivor care team and then through our partnership with MUSC and community partners. And then we also have a community team, and the community team often will do community walks. They'll do different projects in the community. We're doing one with Charleston City Police Partnership Project and Somerville City Police, or the Dignity Project, and those are to develop grassroots partnerships between police and community. And so basically we're out there wherever there's a tension in the community. Our chaplains are out there trying to help provide support and love and listening. But a lot of what we do is working right in the crisis situation and providing that psychological first aid and helping folks in the recovery part. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to pull up on the screen here our planning guide, which you can get a PDF for. And you'll see the school crisis response planning. This form is something that you can literally use to plan out the basic framework of how you'll respond. So let's just imagine an incident. Maybe you've experienced student suicide. Maybe you've experienced the death of a teacher or a well-loved staff member. I hope no one's experienced an active shooter situation, but whatever the traumatic incident or an incident that really impacts the whole school, there are a lot of things that come into play, and there are a lot of expectations that are heaped upon you. One thing to know is that when you lead through a grief or crisis situation, everyone is watching how you handle it. And the way you handle someone else's funeral is how they think you'll handle their funeral. The way you handle and honor someone else's loss is the value they think you'll place on their loss. So it's very important to be thinking ahead strategically, because everything you do or don't do is going to reflect on how people think about your leadership as it applies to them. For example, don't memorialize the locker if you can never figure out a way to unmemorialize it and put it back in the service, or the parking spot of the student or staff member who's lost, right? Don't plant a tree for one person's loss and not for another. So you have to think those things ahead, because you can very quickly memorialize something that you can't maintain for years to come. And then there's always a consequence for that. So one of the ways to help through figuring out how to plan your school's crisis response is identifying the constituents, then identifying the care needed, then identifying what's your collaboration needs, what are your collaborative needs, and then identifying what's your communication. So there are the 4 C's of crisis response: constituents, care, collaboration, and communication. So let's talk about constituents. Who are your constituents? You're not running for political office, so it's not that kind of thing. But when you think of that example, it's the people in your community. Who are your school's constituents? It's not just your teachers. It's not just your students. It may also be your students' families. It may also be the families in the community. It may be those that attend your football games. You don't know what your constituents are until you really sit down and map them out. It may be your board of directors as well. Sometimes you might forget to include certain groups in there, or your parents group. So first thing you do is you make a list of all your constituents, because sometimes you'll forget one of the most important groups that's sort of on the peripheral, but that will come to you later and say, why didn't you call me? Why didn't you let me know? I would have been there, or I should have been there, or something like that. So you make on the list here, you'll see constituents, and on the left-hand side, you'll list all the individuals or groups that may be impacted by whatever crisis. So let's just example that. As an example, God forbid there's an active shooter and on your campus, and God forbid one student is killed, and law enforcement resolved it, so on, or it's in process, right? So who are all the people that might be impacted by that? Or if, God forbid, it was a student suicide, who are all the people who might be impacted, right? So your teachers, your students, your administration, of course, and then the family of the student or students, the family of also your teachers, right? The community, parents of all the kids. If you might have, it might be something that's more just high school, or it might be middle school, or maybe the teacher involved taught elementary school last year, so now elementary school is now involved. Whatever those constituents are and connections are, you want to try and figure that out. Also, your head of school and your leadership. So you need folks to understand that your leaders and your head of school and all your admin and all your leadership, they also need care. They also need folks to notice that they're a constituent. You tend to think when you're in a crisis and leading that you're the one caring for everyone else, but it's very important for you to have someone caring for you. If you're a head of school, it may be a head of school in another school. It's always good for a leader to have another fellow leader that when there's an emergency that happens, they're going to look after them. So I know a lot of fire chiefs who have another fire chief that they know, or police chiefs, they have someone they know somewhere else in the country. They met at some executive school, and they will call them when there's something that happens in their community. It's extremely important. Some of them will even travel and help assist their colleague in their community as they're going through a crisis. So it's really important to have those kinds of things in place if it's that severe. Okay, so you listed all your constituents on one side. So here on the left, you list your constituent. Then you want to list what are the care activities that each constituent may need? What do your students need? Are they going to need counseling? Will they need psychological first aid? Will they need like a group processing? What do your teachers need? Your teachers may need the same exact things. What does your whole school need? Do they need a school assembly? Do your students need some way to express their grief? Do they need like a memorial? Or do they need care stations where they can write a note of their feelings or place something on a tree in remembrance? Are there certain students within that constituent group, within your student group, that might need individual check-ins because they're very close? Maybe God forbid, the student that's lost is on the debate team, or they're active in music and they have a sort of a network of musicians, or they're on the football team and they have a whole team involved that might need a more in-depth check-in. And then, do they need a unity themed event? Is it something where you need to bring everyone together to connect and support one another? Then you're also looking at just the ongoing care. What's going to be your ongoing care for grief resources, for trying to really have some kind of follow through and incremental kind of care? You might have to do a lot of rescheduling. There might be things that those constituents need. Maybe if it's a football team, maybe they need to not play the next game, or do some kind of memorial in the game. There needs to be some kind of, there needs to be consideration there. Creative expression is a great one. A lot of kids with art and expression, it's a great way to work with some of those needs. Also, when you're thinking of those constituents, what are the things that may trigger some of the grief reactions or the crisis response, or something when they return to school that might trigger some of those feelings? If they're constantly seeing a memorial locker for the next 6 months, is there a certain time that you might have another ceremony to sort of return the locker to normal service, or remove it and put something else there, a peace tree or something, that you would design, that they could place messages of hope on, or something like that to bring it forward. So these are things to think about. What are triggers that may be lasting, and how do you sort of reconsecrate those in a sense, or how do you repurpose those so that then there's some healing? And then also, there may be financial needs. Maybe if you've, God forbid, lost a teacher and they were the only one working, maybe there's a way the school can wrap their arms and their support around the family. So these are all important things to think of. What will be the check-ins that you're going to have? How often will you be checking in? Monthly? And then what about the year anniversary? Are you going to check back with that core group of folks that struggled through this? Are you going to hold a public anniversary? So those are all things to think about. So in your planning, don't try and have the end product, just write down your constituents, and then think of what are the things that if I was that person, I would expect someone to do to care for me. So now, once you've written down your care, then you want to ask, who's going to help carry this out? You're not Superman, Superwoman. You can't do everything. So in looking at those activities and those constituents that the activities will help support, excuse me, you're going to ask, who do I draw in to collaborate for these things? Maybe it'll be teachers helping to have support. You can do a memorial service. You could have the school band come over and play. But maybe you want to include your school chaplain if you have one, or maybe the family's clergy or something like that for the memorial service. Or you might want to try and bring folks in. But right in the midst of the crisis, this is where this is really important, because when you think of those care things, if it's going to be something within the first few hours after a traumatic incident, you need to know well in advance who you're going to ask to collaborate and what you're going to ask them to do. And they need to know clearly what your expectations are of them to do and to not do. So, for example, as chaplains, it's very important for us to communicate with schools what we do, because we're not local clergy. We don't go in trying to pray with people or trying to evangelize or anything like that. We go and become what people need, in a sense. If they need psychological first aid, that's how we help them. If they ask us for a prayer, then we'll pray. But we don't go into a public school, certainly, or a private school, and go in with a spiritual agenda. So that's something that's extremely important to communicate ahead of time. You may be a Christian school, and you may have a team of local clergy who may come in and help. That's an environment where it's you can say to them, hey, you're welcome to come in, you're welcome to pray, this kind of thing. But it's very important to dictate those things ahead of time. And local mental health, if you're going to have them come in, you want to tell them, these are the folks I expect you to engage with. This is what I expect. This is what we don't want. We don't want you alone one-on-one with the kids, or we want you in a group, or those kinds of things. A lot of schools will have MOUs, memorandums of understanding, and they'll dictate out what the roles and responsibilities will be. They'll also dictate out the contact person. When you have a contact number for whoever you're going to collaborate with, make sure the contact number isn't by relationship, but by role, because you don't want the head of school, Joe, to call Sally at the mental health center. You want the head of school to call the head of crisis response at the mental health center. That way, when someone retires or flips out of their role, then it's the role communicating with the role. There's a constant update of contact information, because you don't want to develop relationships and then have those pass away because someone moves out of the position. You want it role to role dictated in the MOU with yearly updated phone numbers. So once you have defined what kind of care you need, then that's where you will figure out the collaboration. And you make, in this list right here, you make the list of the positions or roles, the phone numbers, the contact number, and the expectations. And this way, you've got a list that says, on the moment of the incident, when whatever happens, this is what I expect. For us, for example, if we're on a God forbid, a suicide scene of a student, the expectation is, as soon as the coroner makes death notification to the next of kin, we will notify the school district so they can be prepared before school starts the next morning with a crisis response team if needed, or with counselors in place to help those impacted. So that's in our MOU, that we're going to follow XYZ and make those preparations, make those notifications, and then have chaplains available at the school to check in with folks. You might know that your guidance counselors are exactly everything you need to reach out to your students, but your staff needs help too. So you may designate in that MOU, our guidance counselors will help our students, while the mental health staff will help our teachers. All right, sometimes you can help that out. So these are all these different options, and that may be, again, local clergy. It could be mental health. It could be a crisis team that you have. It could be another school's crisis team, because when you go through a crisis, you'd rather have a well-trained, well-oiled machine from another school come in and help your school in your moment of need. And then if they have a moment of need, your crisis team goes to them. Sometimes that's very helpful, because you're both sort of trained in the same kind of way. You could train together, talk through these scenarios together. And then when there's a response or a need, you can help the other school. That can be very, very helpful. It also gives a little bit of emotional distance, where they know you, they care about you, but they're not grieving in the middle of it like you may be. So that's really important to figure out. And then finally, as you're doing your plans, look back at that constituent list and then ask yourself, what kind of communication would I expect if I was a parent? If I heard there's an active shooter in my school, what would I expect if I were a parent of a child in the school and I couldn't reach them on their cell phone? Very important to understand, what kind of communication do your constituents expect, and to set that all up ahead of time, and with a time frame, and with your communication list, whether it be a email list or a phone tree or however you communicate. It's very important to do that. It's also very important to have your PIO, your public information officer, or whoever's your authorized media contact, because when the media calls, you don't want to say no comment. You want to have something ready to say. It could be something as simple as, we're in the middle of an active incident and we're asking for everyone's love and prayers for our school as we work through this or whatever. It could be something to say, we're very thankful for our community that is reaching out and showing great support in this time. Just give someone something, because you don't want to leave an empty space for someone else to fill. So communication is very important. Sometimes you can have a pre-scripted template that you can put some information in. And that's really advisable, of course, with parental contact. One of the biggest complaints we hear from parents and the community is, no one let us know anything. No one let us know. No matter how much you communicate, people will always tell you didn't communicate enough. No one's going to say in a crisis, you know what, I got so tired of them emailing me every hour to tell me what was going on. What people will say is, I didn't know what was going on for 3 hours. I had no clue, right? So make sure you know ahead of time what those communications will be, even if it's a very generic one that you have queued up. So who are those constituents again? What would they want to hear? So school families, your school statement, maybe an official media statement. What do you say to the students when they return into school? Don't let your teachers in an emotional time try and ad-lib what they're going to say. Print it out, have the teacher say, here, I'm being asked to read this to you, and they can read it, and it levels the playing field and helps eliminate a lot of the rumors as well, if you're able to give information. Sometimes, say with a suicide, the family doesn't want you saying anything, so you can't really say anything. And students know, and they understand that you have to make a statement, but you're not allowed to really say anything. But at least making some kind of statement, it's almost like a ritual. It lets people know that we're at this step of the process. This is where things are. This is what happened. This is where we're going. Gives people a sense of informational stability or structure. So very important. Even if you don't have much to say, saying something at designated intervals is important. Social media, of course, social media is going to be extremely important. Having a point of contact that's available for people to reach is extremely important. And then also advertising what kind of memorials or activities you're actually having. That's really important, and who's allowed at them. And if people aren't allowed, what you're going to provide for them later. So if you're just doing something for the students, it's here at this time. The community is invited to whatever, that kind of thing. Also, what really important is to let everyone know the care that's available. Another thing we hear a lot of times is, and there was no one there to support me. Well, maybe there's no one there to support them because all the grief support was in the library or media room, and this student was running from class to class all day and for some reason didn't hear the message, and they go home and they tell their parent who's on the board, they didn't do anything for me, right? But you had all these collaborative folks in there helping. So really important is emailing out a tip sheet and a little summary of the support that's been provided, or hand it out to the students. So when they go home, they have something with some tips on here's what to do if you're experiencing grief. Here's some phone numbers to call if you need to talk to someone. You know, if you need immediate help, here's some other phone numbers, that kind of thing. That way kids go home, they leave it on the counter, or it's a letter to parents, or it's in the email, but there's something in front of them showing, this is what we did today. We had counselors in, we'll have them back tomorrow, we'll have them so on and so forth. They see that you have a clear set process to deal with and address the grief that the students are feeling, because they will come home and they'll sit at the table and they'll grieve, and the parents won't know what to do with it, and they'll look to the professional to help with that situation, and you're the professional. So if that student has brought home a tip sheet on grief, the parent knows there's something being addressed. If they see a referral list there, they know there's some kind of continuum of care, and the parent will feel much more comfort knowing, okay, I'm listening to my child, I'm letting them just sort of vent, but if something, excuse me, if something's a worry, I can make these referrals. Again, it gives a real sense of stability for the parent. It gives a sense of organization, and that there's a structure that the students can move through to get help. Very important. In a crisis situation, not having information is usually one of the biggest issues for anybody. Once people have information and they start to see what the next step is, then there's a greater sense of security, and it gives people sort of somewhere to go. So I hope this has been helpful. That's basically the list there. We also have another that's a sample, and you'll see this was provided by Dr. Jordan. And this here is a sample policy, and this can be you can acquire this through SCISA. And you'll see a sample as far as protocols, who to call. You need a call list. You need some kind of order. You need a policy, a procedure. People like that. They can check boxes, go through, make sure they thought of the things that they don't normally think about. So this sort of runs through some examples and who would be the key contacts. So that'll be available to you, as well as this planning sheet. I just want to say thank you for caring for our students and our families and community. And certainly, if there's anything that we can ever do for you at the Chaplaincy, please feel free to reach out. My email is rich, R-I-C-H, at Coastal Crisis Chaplain, that's how you spell chaplain, .org. And our phone number is 843-724-1212. And many thanks again to SCISA for caring for their students and their schools and helping them plan for a crisis. Hopefully you won't need any of this information ever, but if you do need it, I hope it's been helpful. Thanks for all you do. Take care. Bye-bye.